Hey guys, tonight we step into a world that feels both strangely familiar and utterly alien, the Middle Ages. Imagine you're walking down a narrow cobblestone street at dusk, the air damp with wood smoke and the faint stench of chamber pots tossed from upstairs windows. The people move quickly, cloaks pulled tight, muttering prayers against the dark. But in the corners of this medieval life lies something less talked about, something hidden beneath layers of cloth and secrecy. How women lived with their monthly bleeding. You might think you'd survive it with a quick trip to the pharmacy, but spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't make it past day one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because you might fall asleep during this story and share only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now in your part of the world. Now, turn off the lights and lie down on your chair or bed, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You trudge into a medieval village where the sound of a blacksmith's hammer clangs in the distance and the smell of bread wafts from the communal oven. Yet, beneath this daily rhythm, women carry a monthly burden that is rarely spoken aloud. Menstruation in the Middle Ages is a whisper, a shadow, something society tiptoes around with a mixture of superstition, shame, and fear. The language itself gives it away. Periods are referred to as the curse, the sickness of women, or sometimes simply the flow. Each phrase tells you not just what it is, but how people felt about it. Something dangerous, mysterious, or even sinful. You see, people in this time don't have the neat diagrams of biology textbooks or the soothing explanations of health class. Instead, they live in a world where knowledge comes stitched together from folk tales, fragments of ancient philosophy, and sermons from the pulpit. Menstrual blood, in their eyes, might be medicine, poison, or proof of a woman's closeness to the devil. Historians still argue whether this attitude was universal or if it shifted between regions. But what's certain is that women often had no safe place to openly talk about it. Picture a woman in her 30s, a farmer's wife. She rises before dawn, pulls on her coarse wool dress, and shoulders the day's work. She feels the telltale cramp in her belly, that slow ache announcing another cycle. There are no disposable pads, no quiet runs to the corner store. She grabs a piece of linen worn thin from too many washings, or perhaps a handful of soft moss if linen is scarce. She folds it carefully, places it where it must go, and prays it will last until the evening when she can change it by the privacy of the hearth. Yet still, the risk of staining her skirt is ever present, and with it, the risk of gossip or ridicule. The shame tied to menstruation is almost louder than the bleeding itself. If a woman leaks in public, it's not just an accident. It becomes a mark of humiliation, a subject of cruel laughter, a whispered story carried through the village. You feel the weight of this silence pressing down on every woman, forcing them to conceal what is both ordinary and unavoidable. One quirky tidbit you stumble upon. Some medieval texts claim that menstrual blood could wither crops, turn wine sour, or even rust iron if touched. Others insisted it could cure disease when mixed into ointments. You can almost laugh, but then you realize these ideas shaped real choices, from how women were treated at home to whether they could enter certain sacred spaces. And yes, Someone probably blamed a bad harvest on a woman's time of the month. Even noble women, those perched high in castles with silk and fine cloth at their disposal, are not spared the whispers. Their chambermaids know too much. Their husbands listen for excuses. A queen herself could be accused of being unclean at court, her influence dimmed for a week at a time. Scholars of today argue whether women truly believed in this impurity or simply endured it because the church said so. But either way, the stigma remained. As you wander further down the medieval street, you can almost hear the overlapping voices. Priests warning of sin, physicians scribbling about bodily humors, and neighbors exchanging nervous gossip. It is a world where menstruation is not just a biological fact. It is a symbol, a threat, a social marker that shapes how women are seen. And yet, in the quiet corners of this world, women adapt. They fold their cloths, share whispered remedies, and continue their work, milking cows, stirring stew, carrying water, as though nothing is amiss. Life does not pause, even when their bodies demand it. In this way, you start to see both the burden and the resilience, the silence and the strength woven together like threads of rough homespun cloth. You glance back one more time at the woman by her hearth, adjusting the fabric beneath her skirts, her face composed, but her eyes weary. Around her, the world hums on, oblivious, uninterested, even hostile. But within her, there is endurance, the same endurance carried by countless women before and after, in every age, in every place. And as you drift deeper into this story, you carry that image forward, a life lived beneath the weight of whispers, yet unbroken. You keep moving through those same cobbled streets, noticing how often conversations slip into silence when women pass. The air is thick with the smell of damp hay and burning tallow, but the weight of superstition is heavier still. In this world, menstruation is not simply a natural process. It is a mystery wrapped in fear. You find yourself wondering how people could know so little about something so common. But then you remember, this is an age before microscopes, before germ theory, before the body was seen as anything more than a vessel of divine and devilish forces. Everywhere you turn, the understanding of menstruation feels shaky, fragmented, and flavored with myth. For the medieval mind, blood itself was always loaded with symbolism. Blood meant life. Blood meant sin. Blood meant sacrifice on the altar. And when blood flowed from women every month, it sparked questions that no one could fully answer. Was it a cleansing of the body's impurities, like letting the bad humors escape? Or was it a dangerous sign of weakness and instability? Historians still argue whether most people lean toward one view or the other. But what's clear is that everyone agreed it was something to keep hidden and feared. You overhear a group of men at the tavern, faces ruddy from ale, voices half joking but not entirely. One mutters that women bleed because they are cursed daughters of Eve. Another insists it's God's way of purging poison from their fragile frames. A third scoffs and says it's proof women should not be trusted near sacred relics. You notice the laughter, rough and uneasy, like they're trying to laugh away their own ignorance. And there it is again, the crude humor that hides real anxiety. Meanwhile, women themselves are left with fragments of knowledge passed down from mothers, aunts, and grandmothers. You imagine a girl of 13, pale with fear as she notices her first blood. Her mother pulls her aside, explains quickly, perhaps with more warning than comfort. You're a woman now. Keep clean. Do not let anyone see. There is no ceremony, no celebration, only secrecy. In some villages, there might even be mutterings that the girl must now be watched more closely, as though her body had suddenly become dangerous to the community. One quirky tidbit you stumble upon comes from an old medical manuscript claiming that if a menstruating woman looked at a mirror, the glass might tarnish. Another swears that if she touched a puppy, the poor animal might die within days. Silly? Absolutely. But these beliefs mattered, shaping how women moved in their daily lives. A woman might avoid holding her own newborn during her period, not because she wanted to, but because everyone around her warned that she could harm the child. You sense that knowledge here is less about science and more about power. The church looms large, preaching purity and impurity, setting rules about when women can enter a church or receive the sacrament. Menstruation becomes another reason to control where women can go, what they can touch, and how they are seen. Yet physicians, too, add their voices, writing thick Latin texts about bodily humors, hot, cold, wet, and dry, trying to slot menstruation into their neat but wobbly theories. To them, the monthly bleeding is either proof the body is healthy, expelling excess, or evidence of illness when it stops. The irony? Both could be right, depending on what story needed to be told. In the marketplace, you see the practical consequences. A woman who bleeds heavily is whispered about as weak, unfit, or even cursed. A woman who doesn't bleed at all might be called barren, unworthy of marriage. The truth of her health hardly matters. What matters is the perception, and perception rules everything here. You realize quickly that in this society, a woman's body is not her own. It is a public story, told through gossip, sermons, and superstition. And yet, for all the fear and silence, life goes on. Women cook, clean, harvest, and raise children whether or not they are bleeding. They may duck into the shadows to adjust a cloth or pause at the river to rinse fabric, but their work never stops. You notice their resilience, the way they carry on without complaint, as though the burden is as natural as breathing. You smile at the thought of one medieval scholar who argued that menstruation actually made women more balanced than men. His reasoning? Women had a natural outlet for their excess humors, while men bottled everything up and burst into violence. A rare argument in women's favor, though you suspect he'd be laughed out of the tavern. Still, it's a reminder that even in the Middle Ages, not everyone agreed on what menstruation meant. As you wander deeper into this story, you feel the clash of voices. Priests declaring sin, doctors prescribing leeches, neighbors spreading rumors, and women whispering advice to daughters. The monthly mystery remains unsolved, a shadow that shapes every corner of daily life. And for the women living it, the mystery is less about why and more about how to survive it without being shamed. And so, you carry that image with you. A world where a natural process is tangled in superstition. A secret that shapes entire lives. You realize that behind every closed door, every darkened hut, and every castle chamber, the same mystery repeats itself. Month after month, year after year, you drift further into that medieval world, and now your eyes are drawn not to the whispers of priests or the fearful mutterings of men, but to the simple, practical question: what did women actually use? You lean closer to the homespun rhythms of daily life and find that coping with menstruation in the Middle Ages was less about philosophy and more about whatever materials could be found at hand. Picture a woman waking before dawn, fumbling in the dim light for the scraps she has set aside. Linen is most common, rough, coarse, and often patched. These strips of cloth are cut from worn-out garments, too tattered to serve as anything but rags. She folds them carefully, layers them for thickness, and ties them into her undergarments if she is lucky enough to have any. Many poorer women simply hold the cloth in place between their thighs, praying it doesn't shift as they move through their work. And yes, washing and reusing is the norm. No one has the luxury of discarding fabric so precious. In some regions, moss gathered from riverbanks or forest floors is pressed into service. You can almost feel its damp coolness, soft at first, then rough when dried. It absorbs well enough, but leaves behind tiny irritations. And of course, the risk of infection is ever present. Women also turn to sheep's wool, flax, or even bundled grasses, each chosen not for comfort, but for necessity. Historians still argue whether these improvisations were widespread or only in times of scarcity, but the point remains: nothing about this experience was easy. Imagine the awkwardness of laundering these cloths in a public stream. A woman crouches low, rubbing the linen against stones, trying to keep her movements discreet. But the water turns faintly red, and someone nearby might glance over. In a world where blood is never neutral, this simple act risks drawing whispers or suspicion. It is no wonder, then, that many women chose to bury their soiled cloths, believing that menstrual blood left exposed could attract evil spirits. Or worse, the attention of gossipy neighbors. One quirky tidbit you come across: in certain medieval households, men genuinely believed that menstrual rags could be used as love charms or curses. A rag hidden beneath a bed might secure a lover's fidelity or drive him mad. Imagine poor women, not only struggling to wash and hide their cloths, but also worrying that someone might dig them up to wield them as witchcraft. If you're thinking that's a lot of pressure for what is basically laundry, you're right. Among noble women, the picture looks a little different, but not much easier. Their cloths might be softer, woven from finer linen, sometimes stitched into rudimentary pads that could be tied with cords around the waist. But comfort is relative. Imagine layers of brocade gowns and heavy skirts pressing down in summer heat. A single misstep could leave a stain visible to courtiers, and the risk of humiliation was enormous. Even in a gilded chamber, privacy was rare, with servants and ladies-in-waiting constantly present. The noblewoman may have had access to more fabric, but her burden of dignity was far heavier. You pass by a medieval healer, her table cluttered with jars of herbs and dried flowers. She advises women to use plant-based poultices to soothe cramps, and sometimes even to soak cloths in vinegar before wearing them, believing it would cleanse impurities. Was it helpful? Perhaps in some cases, though it probably burned more often than it soothed. Historians still debate whether such remedies were rooted in genuine observation or in a mixture of faith and desperation. Then there are those who had little to nothing. Peasant women working in the fields sometimes bled freely into their clothes with no time or resources to do otherwise. You picture her bending over rows of wheat, sweat dripping into her eyes, ignoring the trickle down her legs because the harvest won't wait. The body cycle collides with the Earth's, and the Earth wins. This all leaves you with a sense of resilience so quiet it almost goes unnoticed. Women adapted, endured, and kept moving. They stitched old cloths, gathered moss, washed linen by riversides, buried soiled rags in gardens, whispered remedies to daughters. They faced not only discomfort, but also the judgment of their communities, carrying both the physical and social weight of their cycles. You can almost laugh, just a little, at the thought of how modern advertisements show carefree women running through fields in white dresses. If you showed that image to a medieval woman, she'd probably think you'd lost your mind. White linen, outdoors, during a period, she'd hand you a bundle of moss and tell you to try again. And so, the image of coping becomes layered. The rag folded in secret, the moss gathered at dawn, the washing done in silence, the cloth buried in earth. Behind every cottage door, every castle curtain, lies the same hidden work, humble, practical, and endlessly repeated. You wander deeper, and now your eyes settle on something even heavier than moss or cloth: the weight of shame. In this world, a stain isn't just a stain, it's a mark, a public proclamation that a woman's secret cycle has slipped beyond her control. Imagine the dread of looking down at your dress in church or marketplace and seeing the telltale crimson. There are no backup jeans tied around the waist, no jackets casually slipped over laps. Here, a spot of blood is enough to fuel gossip for weeks. You notice how women move carefully, their steps measured, their skirts subtly adjusted with each motion. They aren't only managing their bodies, they're managing their reputations. A peasant woman who stains her clothing in the fields may become the butt of cruel jokes at the tavern. A noblewoman whose gown is soiled might face whispers at court, whispers that reach her husband or rivals eager to use her uncleanliness against her. In both cases, the shame doesn't fade quickly. It lingers like a stain on memory long after the fabric has been washed. Why such stigma? In part, because the church reinforced it. Priests preached that menstrual blood was a sign of Eve's curse, a monthly reminder of sin and disobedience. This idea, repeated again and again, became embedded in daily life. Women absorbed it silently, men wielded it openly, and society shaped itself around it. Historians still argue whether women internalize this shame fully or simply perform compliance to avoid punishment. But either way, the rules pressed down on them. And then there were the jokes. Men, nervous in their ignorance, turned discomfort into humor. You overhear one farmer teasing that women shouldn't sit on stools during their sickness, or else the wood would rot. Another swears he can tell when his wife is unclean because the butter she churns comes out sour. You can roll your eyes, but for the women living it, such crude humor wasn't harmless. It reminded them constantly that their cycles were something to be mocked, feared, and hidden. One quirky tidbit surfaces from an old collection of folk beliefs. Some people thought menstrual blood could reveal secrets if smeared on door frames, causing gossip to spill from liars' mouths. It's almost comical, imagining women holding this unexpected superpower, while at the same time being punished for the very thing that gave it to them. Medieval irony at its finest. You also hear of households where menstruating women were told not to prepare food. Bread kneaded by their hands might fail to rise, or meat salted during their cycle might spoil too quickly. Of course, when a loaf collapsed, or a barrel of meat went bad, people didn't question the yeast or the weather. They blamed the woman. In a world where food scarcity already pressed like a shadow, such blame could easily slip into cruelty. The shame was not just social, but internal too. Picture a girl of 15, still new to this cycle, terrified of the moment her cloth might slip while working in the fields. She feels cramps bite her belly, but she doesn't dare complain. If she draws attention, she risks mockery. If she hides it, she risks a stain. Either way, her body has betrayed her. You can feel her cheeks burn with the same intensity as the red hidden beneath her skirts. Among noble households, the stakes were even higher. A duchess or queen, constantly watched by courtiers, could not risk humiliation. Her maids guarded her privacy fiercely, washing and disposing of cloths discreetly. But all it would take was one servant whispering of a stain on a gown for rumors to spiral. Even a queen's dignity was fragile when it collided with this monthly truth. You notice, too, how women developed strategies against shame. Some wore darker fabrics during their cycle to hide stains. Others stayed close to home, excusing themselves from markets or feasts if possible. A few feigned illness to avoid public appearances. Their world was full of careful calculations: how to hide, how to endure, how to keep the whispers at bay. As you move on, the feeling of heaviness lingers. Not just the physical burden of cloths or cramps, but the invisible weight of society's judgment. The body, in its natural rhythm, becomes a trap. A woman bleeds, and suddenly her reputation, her household role, her very dignity are all at risk. And yet, she rises each morning, dresses, and steps back into a world ready to laugh at her misstep. The shame was real, but so too was the resilience. Women endured it month after month, year after year, knowing the risk, but carrying on anyway. In their quiet perseverance lies a kind of defiance, not loud, not rebellious, but steady as the turning of the seasons. You slip quietly from the village lanes into the echoing stone walls of a church. The air is cool, heavy with incense, and the flicker of candles throws shadows across worn wooden pews. Here, the voice of authority is not a neighbor's gossip or a husband's crude joke, but the booming certainty of the priest. And when it comes to menstruation, the church's word carries enormous weight. You hear sermons that weave together scripture and superstition, painting women's monthly cycles as a reminder of Eve's sin. According to many clerics, menstruation was not simply a biological fact, but a visible mark of spiritual impurity. Women who bled were often told they should not approach the altar, should not receive communion, and in some cases, should not even set foot inside the church itself. It wasn't just about health. It was about holiness. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were uniformly enforced. Some rural parishes may have looked the other way, simply grateful for any woman willing to scrub the floors or light the candles. But in larger towns and cathedrals, rules could be strict. Imagine the humiliation of being turned away at the church door, your faith questioned because of a natural rhythm your body cannot control. One priest's manual even claimed that menstruating women could spoil holy water if they dipped their fingers into the font. Another insisted their breath alone could wither a grapevine if they walked too close. It sounds absurd now, but to believers at the time, these warnings were deadly serious. You can almost picture a woman keeping her distance during Mass, shifting subtly in her seat, trying not to draw attention to herself. Yet, the Church's teachings were not all consistent. Some theologians, influenced by ancient medical texts, argued that menstruation was actually a natural cleansing, proof that the body worked as God designed it. Still, the majority leaned on the side of suspicion, treating women's cycles as an echo of sin. A theologian's pen might scratch out mercy, but the pulpit's voice boomed far louder with condemnation. A quirky tidbit emerges from medieval penitential handbooks, those guides priests used to assign penances. Some listed specific sins tied to menstruation. For instance, if a woman failed to abstain from sex during her period, the prescribed penance might be weeks of fasting or extra prayers. Imagine the double bind, a woman already weighed down by cramps and shame now burdened with enforced guilt, as though her body's cycle was her fault. You step into a side chapel where a group of women pray together, heads bowed, hands clasped. They are not excluded entirely. Faith is too vital to deny them completely. But you can sense their cautiousness. The Church has made them believe that their bodies carry danger, and so their faith becomes something tinged with fear. Among nobles, the Church's stance carried political weight. A queen suspected of impurity might find her influence at court diminished. A rival faction could whisper that she had approached relics while menstruating, thereby polluting them. In a world where spiritual authority and political power were deeply entwined, such whispers could be weaponized. It wasn't only about exclusion, it was about control. By framing menstruation as unclean, the Church gained leverage over when women could participate, when they could speak, even when they could stand before God. It turned the private into public, the biological into spiritual discipline, and the echo of those rules pressed into every cottage and castle across Europe. Still, you wonder, did women themselves believe all this? Some surely did, absorbing the sermons as truth. Others likely rolled their eyes in private, knowing their bodies better than any priest. But the risk of defiance was high. Better to bow the head, whisper the prayer, and carry the shame in silence. You leave the church, stepping back into the open air. The bells toll, summoning people to prayer. But for many women, the summons comes with hesitation. You realize now that menstruation in the Middle Ages wasn't only a private matter of cloths and cramps. It was also a public matter of faith, sin, and control. The body was not just the body, it was a battleground of doctrine. And so the church's shadow stretched long across the lives of women, shaping not just what they believed about God, but what they believed about themselves. You leave the echoing stone arches of the church and drift into the chamber of a learned physician, where shelves sag beneath manuscripts copied in careful Latin hand. Here, the voices of scholars rise, blending fragments of Aristotle, Galen, and the newer whispers of Arabic medicine. And at the center of their debates lies a simple but unsettling question. What does menstruation actually do to the body? The physician, quill in hand, scratches his beard as he explains to an eager student. Menstrual blood, he insists, is the body's way of purging excess humors. Without it, a woman would be poisoned from within. He gestures to a chart of circles and arrows, showing blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile swirling like restless elements. In this worldview, balance is everything, and bleeding is a way to maintain it. But not everyone agrees. Another scholar insists that menstruation is dangerous, a weakening of the female body that leaves her fragile, hysterical, and prone to melancholy. He warns his pupils that women are naturally colder and wetter than men, and that their cycles are proof of this inherent imbalance. Historians still argue whether such medical opinions were widely accepted or if they were mainly confined to universities. But what's certain is that these texts filtered down eventually, shaping the way communities viewed women's health. You lean closer, and you hear remedies being prescribed. For cramps, leeches along the inner thighs. For irregular cycles, herbal infusions mixed with wine, and sometimes even ground coral. To stop excessive bleeding, cupping, cauterization, or a strong dose of powdered toad bones. You wince, but the physicians remain solemn, convinced of their authority. One might even recommend pregnancy as the ultimate cure, since it halts the cycle for months. Imagine the sigh of the woman hearing that advice, realizing her body's pain is being dismissed as a reason to bear another child. Yet medicine also carried contradictions. Some texts praised menstruation as a cleansing force, explaining that women were healthier because they released their impurities monthly. Others treated it as proof of weakness. This double-edged view meant that no woman could ever quite win. If she bled, she was unclean. If she didn't, she was diseased. A cruel paradox wrapped neatly in scholarly ink. And then there were the stranger ideas. A quirky tidbit you uncover comes from a physician who claimed menstrual blood could sharpen a blade if smeared along its edge. Another insisted it could be used in potions to cure leprosy. These suggestions didn't always stay in books. Sometimes they leaked into practice, leaving women's cycles tied to both fear and fascination. You can't help but smirk at the thought of a knight polishing his sword with a cloth he'd never dared touch if he knew the truth. At the same time, midwives and village healers had their own wisdom, separate from the university halls. They often relied on herbs like rue, pennyroyal, or sage, used either to ease cramps or to bring on the flow if it had stopped. Their remedies were born less from theory and more from experience, whispered from one woman to another across generations. And yet, when disputes arose, it was always the male physician's Latin text that carried authority, not the lived knowledge of the women themselves. One debate that still lingers in historical circles is whether menstruation was ever truly medicalized as disease in this period. Some argue that physicians genuinely believed it was a natural process, simply misinterpreted through humors. Others suggest that medical men framed it as pathology precisely to assert authority over women's bodies. Whatever the case, the outcome was the same. Women's experiences became something to be explained about them, not with them. Picture again that young peasant woman in the fields. She doesn't know Galen or Aristotle, but she knows the pain in her belly, the relief when her flow is regular, the fear when it isn't. Yet if she seeks help from a physician, he won't ask her how she feels. He'll simply prescribe a purge or a prayer, convinced that his book knowledge outweighs her lived truth. And so the story unfolds. Blood as cure, blood as poison, blood as weakness, blood as strength. In the dim light of medieval medicine, nothing is certain, and women's bodies remain a puzzle debated endlessly by men with quills, while the women themselves endure in silence. You can almost chuckle at the irony. Centuries of learned men scribbling furiously about menstruation, while the women they describe are busy boiling water, folding linen, or milking cows, solving the problem practically while theory spins on parchment. But that was the Middle Ages in a nutshell. Endless words from scholars and endless endurance from women. You leave behind the cold ink of physicians' manuscripts and drift into the warmer, earthier world of folk practices. Here, away from the cloisters and universities, women whisper remedies to one another across kitchens, gardens, and market stalls. It is a world less about theory and more about survival, where the cycle is managed with herbs, charms, and improvisations that blur the line between medicine and magic. You picture a midwife crouched by the hearth, stirring a small pot of herbs into steaming wine. She whispers to a young woman doubled over in pain, assuring her that this mixture of sage, chamomile, and mugwort will ease the cramps. Does it work? Maybe. Mugwort has properties that today we'd call antispasmodic, but here in the Middle Ages, it is also thought to ward off evil spirits. The cure is both botanical and spiritual. Some remedies are practical. Pennyroyal brewed as tea to stimulate delayed periods, fennel seeds chewed for relief, or yarrow poultices pressed against aching bellies. But others stray into the fantastical. One recipe advises women to wear an amulet made from a dried frog tied around the waist to reduce bleeding. Another suggests drinking wine in which iron nails have been steeped. You can't help but laugh softly at the image of a medieval woman politely sipping her nail wine while pretending not to notice the metallic tang. Quirky tidbits abound. In one corner of Europe, women believed that carrying a sprig of basil in their skirts could regulate the flow. In another, a charm written on parchment and worn against the skin was said to keep the cycle steady. You imagine these charms passed from mother to daughter, worn discreetly beneath woolen gowns, talismans of hope against the unpredictable tides of the body. Historians still argue whether such practices were dismissed as superstition by the church or tolerated as long as they were framed in the language of prayer. A mugwort tea might be harmless enough, but if someone suspected it of being witchcraft, the healer could be accused of meddling with diabolical forces. For midwives, the line between respected wisdom and dangerous heresy was razor thin. You find yourself at a marketplace where women swap recipes for remedies as easily as they trade eggs or bread. One peasant woman swears by rubbing goose fat on the lower belly. Another insists that walking barefoot through the morning dew eases cramps. You smirk at the thought of medieval women turning their fields into makeshift spas. But beneath the humor lies something important. Women trusted one another's knowledge more than they trusted the scholars or priests. Their remedies came from experience, from bodies lived rather than bodies theorized. And yet the remedies weren't always kind. Some cures were harsher than the illness. To staunch excessive bleeding, one folk recipe called for burning horsehair and inhaling the smoke. Another suggested holding a live toad in the hand until it urinated, believing its liquid carried a balancing force. The desperation to find relief often led women down uncomfortable, even dangerous paths. Imagine the secrecy of it all. A young girl, embarrassed by her heavy bleeding, might sneak herbs from her mother's garden at dawn. A midwife, cautious of prying eyes, whispers instructions by lamplight. Remedies are exchanged in hushed tones, wrapped in the protective veil of womanhood's shared struggle. These networks of knowledge, part science, part superstition, were lifelines. One debate among modern scholars asks whether these remedies actually empowered women or reinforced their isolation. On one hand, folk knowledge gave them tools beyond what male physicians offered. On the other, it kept them confined to the private sphere. Their wisdom always one accusation of witchcraft away from danger. Still, when you look at the resilience in these practices, it's hard not to see quiet resistance, a refusal to let their bodies be defined only by shame and control. As you wander away from the midwife's hearth, the air carries the scent of dried herbs, smoke, and secrecy. You realize that, while the church thundered and the physicians debated, it was these folk remedies, half herbal, half magical, that actually touched the lives of countless women. Beneath the surface of medieval society ran an underground current of shared knowledge, woven into every cup of tea, every whispered charm, every sprig of basil tied into a skirt. And you carry with you the image of resilience wrapped in mystery. Women clutching amulets, sipping bitter brews, or walking barefoot through wet grass at dawn, doing whatever it took to wrest a little comfort from the world's indifference. You drift now into the rhythms of daily life. And what strikes you isn't only the whispered remedies or the folded linen, but the endless list of rules that circled around menstruating women like invisible chains. These weren't laws written in parchment with royal seals. They were rules enforced by culture, by custom, by raised eyebrows and muttered threats. And as you listen, you realize how many doors quietly closed to women during their monthly bleeding. You overhear a villager warning his wife not to touch the milk pail while she bleeds. He swears that if she does, the milk will curdle in the churn. At the baker's oven, another woman is told to stay away from the dough, for her unclean hands might prevent the bread from rising. And in the vineyards, men whisper that if a menstruating woman brushes past the vines, the grapes will shrivel before harvest. Imagine being told that your very presence could ruin the food supply. Some restrictions reached even stranger heights. In certain texts, you find claims that menstruating women should avoid making eye contact with beehives because the bees might die or flee. One quirky tidbit even suggests that if a menstruating woman stepped onto a field of wheat, the crops would wither in her footsteps. You can almost chuckle at the absurdity, but then you remember. For the women who lived under these beliefs, it was no joke. Every step they took risked suspicion. Every action risked blame. The rules extended beyond fields and kitchens into sacred spaces. Many were barred from approaching altars, handling relics, or even touching holy books. Imagine the sting of faith turned against you, not because of your sins, but because of your body's natural rhythm. Historians still argue whether these bans were enforced everywhere or only in more rigid communities. But the fear they produced was real enough to shape women's behavior. You notice how women adapted. A woman on her cycle might excuse herself from baking duties, not because she believed in the rule, but because the risk of being blamed for spoiled bread was too high. Another might avoid church altogether during her bleeding days, not wanting the stares or whispers if anything went wrong during Mass. In a world where survival was precarious, no one wanted to be accused of angering God or spoiling the village butter. And yet, rules had a strange duality. While they restricted women, they also sometimes offered them small escapes. Imagine the relief of a farmer's wife told not to carry water during her period because her uncleanliness might taint the well. For once, the burden of work is lifted, even if under the guise of superstition. You can almost hear her sigh of secret gratitude as she rests her aching body by the fire, while her husband hauls the bucket himself. Oppressive? Yes, but occasionally, accidentally, merciful. There were, of course, darker edges. A woman suspected of breaking these taboos could be shamed or even punished. If the butter soured, who would they blame? If the bread failed, who would be accused? And if the harvest faltered, well, it must have been that unlucky woman walking through the fields at the wrong time of the month. In communities where survival depended on fragile crops, scapegoating was a dangerous reality. You can't help but smile at the irony of one medieval physician who actually defended women, writing that none of these rules made sense. He argued that menstruation was simply natural and that blaming women for spoiled butter was ridiculous. But his voice was rare, lost in a sea of louder superstitions. And even today, historians debate how widespread these prohibitions truly were. Were they practiced by everyone? Or were they exaggerated in texts more than in daily life? The truth probably lies somewhere between, but for the women who lived under them, the restrictions were real enough. Imagine living with the constant awareness that your body was considered hazardous, not just inconvenient, but dangerous to crops, food, and faith. Each month, you step carefully, avoiding certain chores, staying away from sacred spaces, shrinking your presence so as not to invite blame. And yet, beneath these rules lies resilience again. Women learn to navigate, to comply outwardly while carving spaces of quiet strength inwardly. They brewed herbs, folded linen, carried on their tasks in secret, and shared whispers with one another. The rules tried to shrink them, but life forced them to adapt, to continue, to endure. You leave this world of prohibitions with a lingering image. A woman in a dim kitchen, stirring a pot of stew, her hand steady despite the whispers around her. She knows that if the meal spoils, they'll blame her blood. And yet she stirs anyway, feeding her family, sustaining her community, carrying the weight of both myth and reality with the same quiet strength. You slip away from the smoky kitchens and muddy fields, and your steps now carry you up the winding stairs of a castle. The air here is different, cooler, perfumed faintly with lavender, heavy with tapestries muffling the stone walls. You might think noble women had it easier, surrounded by silk and servants. But as you lean closer, you realize that menstruation doesn't spare even those draped in velvet. It simply hides behind finer fabrics. Imagine a lady of the court, dressed in layers of brocade and damask. Beneath all the glitter, she still faces the same monthly dilemma: how to protect herself from stains. Instead of moss or coarse rags, she has access to softer linen, sometimes even stitched into pads with ties that loop around the waist. These cloths are laundered in private by servants, discreetly disposed of in castle fires, or washed in hidden basins. But privacy is never perfect. Servants see everything. The risk of gossip lingers in every chamber. A noble woman may keep a locked chest filled with folded cloths, scented with herbs to mask the smell. You can almost picture her maid carrying a discreet bundle down dark corridors, praying no one notices. Here, secrecy is more delicate, but also more perilous, because scandal at court can ruin reputations faster than spoiled bread ever could in a village. And yet, noble women's challenges weren't only about stains. They were about appearances. Court life demanded constant presence at feasts, ceremonies, and dances. How do you excuse yourself gracefully when your belly cramps and your back aches? How do you smile and flirt at a banquet when you're worried about a sudden rush of blood beneath layers of silk? The risk of humiliation was magnified by the ever-watchful eyes of courtiers eager to find a weakness. One quirky tidbit surfaces from court gossip. Some queens were rumored to have elaborate padded chairs lined with absorbent cloth, reserved for their days of sickness. Whether fact or embellishment, the image is telling. A symbol of how much attention and anxiety could surround a noble woman's cycle. Imagine the snickers behind gloved hands, the whispers echoing down stone halls. Historians still argue whether noble women had more control over their menstruation than peasants. On the one hand, they had better materials, private chambers, and loyal servants. On the other, their lives were under relentless scrutiny, every misstep amplified by politics. For a duchess or queen, a bloodstain could be transformed from private accident into public scandal, even political ammunition. Consider also the role of dynastic pressure. For noble women, menstruation wasn't just a nuisance. It was tied directly to fertility. A regular cycle meant hope for heirs. Irregular bleeding sparked rumors of barrenness. Imagine a young queen, barely 16, with courtiers whispering about whether her courses had begun, whether her womb would bring forth sons. Her body became a matter of state, her cycles recorded like political events. Privacy, in this sense, was impossible, and when a queen's courses stopped, through pregnancy or age, the consequences rippled through kingdoms. A missed period could send the court into frenzy. Was she expecting? Was the line secure? Or was her body failing its duty? The very rhythm of her cycle became entangled with dynastic survival. You can't help but chuckle at the thought of a banquet where beneath the glittering goblets and golden plates, half the whispered talk might be about whether the queen's flow had arrived on time. Politics and gossip fed on biology, and noble women lived caught in that strange intersection of velvet and vulnerability. But behind the courtly spectacle lies the same endurance. You see her, some nameless countess in her private chamber, resting on a cushioned bench, pressing a warm cloth to her belly, sipping an infusion of herbs brought secretly by her maid. Outside, music plays and torches blaze. But for a moment, she is simply a woman enduring the same cycle as the washerwoman and the milkmaid. The castle walls don't change that truth. They only add more eyes to watch it. And so, as you leave the castle halls, you carry a curious image. Menstruation, dressed in velvet. Softer cloths, scented herbs, private basins, and yet the same burden of secrecy, the same fear of shame. Whether in a peasant's hut or a queen's chamber, the rhythm of blood beats steady and inescapable, shaping lives high and low alike. You tread a muddy path before sunrise, your breath a pale cloud in the chill. Roosters doing their best impression of an alarm clock because, of course, there's no snooze button in the 14th century. The ground squelches under your shoes, if you're lucky enough to have them, and your belly cramps with that familiar ache. Work won't wait. The cow won't milk itself. The water won't carry itself. And the steward won't accept monthly pains as an excuse for missing your dues. You press the folded linen tighter, adjust your wool skirt, and keep moving. OSHA hasn't been invented yet. The health and safety officer is basically your own spine. In the peasant's world, labor runs on two clocks: the season and the sun. Spring demands planting. Summer demands weeding. Autumn screams harvest. And winter asks you to keep breathing and keep the fire from dying. Menstruation slots into this cycle with no special treatment. You churn butter while trying not to think about all those jokes that it'll sour in your hands. Feed pigs, split kindling, fetch water from the stream. Then grind grain on the quernstone until your shoulders burn. A mainstream historical fact sits right here on your table. Bread is the daily anchor of diet for most rural households. Pottage bubbling a close second, so the work of turning grain into food cannot pause for cramps. Privacy is a luxury. Your cottage is one room, maybe two, with people and livestock sharing air. If you need to rinse your cloth, you plan the moment carefully. Dawn at the stream is best, when mist drifts like a curtain and nobody's watching. Your fingers go numb in the water. The red unfurls in thin ribbons and disappears. You scrub fast, mindful of the stories that still echo, about blood that can spoil fish or blight crops. Stories you don't believe but can't afford to challenge. You tuck the wet linen under your cloak to dry by the hearth later, where smoke paints everything the color of dusk. Clothing doesn't play nice. The wool scratches, the seams rub, and every step threatens chafing. Historians still argue whether peasant women wore close-fitting undergarments that could reliably anchor pads. Most evidence points to a long linen shift under the gown, while braids were more commonly male. Yet a few finds and images hint at regional exceptions. What matters to you, though, is that nothing is purpose-built for periods. You become a master of knots, folds, and prayer. On heavy days, some women bleed into their clothes and simply keep working, less from stoicism than from raw necessity. The harvest won't pause, so you can rearrange your moss. Food shapes how your body copes. Your meals lean on barley or rye bread, cabbages, leeks, and whatever pulses last through winter. Meat flashes by on feast days. With so little iron, you tire faster. The world narrows to a tunnel of tasks and aches. Still, you sip small beer, weak ale safer than water alone, and keep walking. If someone invented a medieval fitness tracker, it would congratulate you on 20,000 steps by mid-morning, and then ask if you're training for a marathon called survival. Quirky tidbits flutter in from the hedgerows of belief. Some women knot a red thread around the waist to bind the flow to regular days. Others wear a heavy iron key at the girdle, not only because it opens the chest, but because iron is thought to fend off troublesome spirits, and by sympathetic logic, steady a troublesome cycle. You might smile at that. Then you hook the key anyway, because even hope is a kind of medicine. A neighbor swears that warming a flat river stone by the hearth and tucking it into a cloth against the belly eases cramps. That one, at least, feels like kindness disguised as geology. Community can bruise or cradle. Old women, the veterans of 1,000 cycles, pass down tricks. Fold the cloth on the bias so it rubs less. Smear a little goose fat on the inner thighs against chafing. Drink a mugwort infusion before bed. The Whisper Network you met before hums here too, an underground current of help that the manor court neither sees nor regulates. But the same village that shelters you can also sting. If the loaf falls flat, if the cheese veers bitter, you know exactly whose day of the month the jokes will point to. You've learned to leave dough kneading to someone else on heavy days, not because you believe, but because you're tired of being proof. Work obligations sit like stones in your pockets. Manorial customs demand labor, hoe days, harvest days, cartage days, and fines follow absence. Historians still argue whether village practice gave women informal slack during bleeding days. Records show little mercy in writing, even if neighbors sometimes swapped tasks in quiet solidarity. Mostly, you calculate. You choose the tasks that keep you nearest to home. Carve moments to slip inside and change linen. Lean a hip to the hearth to dry what you've just washed. If your period arrives during harvest, you bind tighter and join the reapers anyway. Because grain waits for no one. And gleaning rights, those precious leftovers after the Lord's sheaves, pay in bread. The landscape itself meddles. In summer, heat makes everything stick and sting. In winter, the cold gnaws your belly and stiffens clots. Every cramp a small iron hand. Rain turns lanes into bogs, so that walking jars you with each step. You learn routes that keep you near hedges, that give small privacy if you must stop and adjust. You carry a spare cloth in your apron. Vital kit, stashed where a modern person might keep a phone. And you become so deft at quick changes that, were there medals for logistics, your name would glitter at the Guildhall. Medicine, such as it is, seldom visits your door. The physician in town costs coin and speaks in humors. You prefer the midwife's kitchen, where she brews sage in wine, shows you how to press a palm into the ache and breathe slow, and never makes you feel like a walking sermon. She tells you to rest if you can, and sometimes the world conspires to grant it. Don't draw from the well today, someone warns. Bad luck while you bleed. The rule is nonsense, but for once, nonsense means you sit by the fire for a half hour, and that small mercy tastes like a feast. Strength hides in the ordinary. You shoulder a yoke with 2 sloshing buckets. Keep your hips steady and match your breath to your steps. You card wool, your fingers working memory while cramps ebb and punch back. You help birth a neighbor's kid, goat or human, both happen, while your own body does its relentless math. No one carves statues of these labors. No monk illuminates a page with the scene of you rinsing linen at dawn. But the village stands on the invisible scaffold of women's work, and you feel that truth with every tired muscle. There's humor, too, because there has to be. Your period tracking app is the moon and a charcoal tally on the beam. Your mood ring is whether you snap at the chicken that hides underfoot. Your wellness retreat is a quiet 5 minutes behind the bread oven while the loaf rises and you hope it actually rises. You grin at your own small jokes, because even laughter is resistance when the day is long. And beneath everything, mud, labor, superstition, beats something steady. You endure the month's turn without fanfare, refine a craft of coping from linen and patience, and walk home at dusk with the sky a low blue bowl above the thatch. The castle has tapestries and private basins. Your cottage has smoke and a hearth. The blood is the same in both places. What changes is who sees it and who holds power over the story it tells. You slip inside, hang your cloth to dry near the embers, and close the door on the wind. Tomorrow, you'll do it all again, not because you are unbreakable, but because you are needed, and because need in this world is stronger than pain. You follow the sound of laughter now, rough and uneven, spilling out of the tavern door like froth from a badly poured ale. Inside, men huddle around trestle tables, mugs clattering, voices thick with drink. Their words are not kind. Their jokes circle back, again and again, to the same subject: women and their bleeding. It isn't medical. It isn't holy. It isn't even curious. It's comic fodder, a way for men to turn their unease into nervous humor. You listen, and the jokes sound familiar, even timeless. A farmer boasts that he can always tell when his wife is unclean, because the butter she churns tastes sour. His friend slaps the table, roaring with laughter. Another man grins, saying he won't let his daughter knead dough during her time, lest the bread collapse like a failed miracle. They howl, ignoring the fact that their bread has collapsed plenty of times without women's cycles to blame. The laughter masks something deeper: fear. These men don't understand menstruation, but they know it unsettles them. So they disguise discomfort with crude humor. A mainstream historical fact emerges here. Medieval texts, written by male authors, often describe menstruation in the language of danger and pollution, and the everyday man echoes it without needing parchment. His jokes about curdled milk or spoiled beer come straight from those same whispered warnings. Society's official view and its tavern chatter reinforce each other, locking women into a cycle of both superstition and ridicule. And yet fear often takes stranger shapes than laughter. Some men whisper in earnest that menstrual blood is poisonous. They warn each other that sleeping with a menstruating woman will shrivel a man's manhood, or even kill him outright. Others insist that the blood itself could be used in curses, brewed into love potions, or slipped into an enemy's drink. You can almost picture a peasant clutching his mug tighter, suddenly suspicious of every woman who ever handed him ale. One quirky tidbit you stumble across. A medieval chronicler claimed that if a menstruating woman looked directly at a mirror, the glass would fog or crack. Imagine the nervous energy behind that. Men afraid not only of women's bodies, but of their reflected gaze. You smirk, but for them, it was deadly serious. A woman's monthly cycle wasn't just biology. It was sorcery, danger, comedy, and shame, all rolled into one. Historians still argue whether men truly believed all these wild claims, or whether they repeated them as convenient excuses to keep women at arm's length. But what's certain is that the atmosphere of mockery and suspicion created a hostile background hum for women's lives. Imagine overhearing such words daily, knowing that your ordinary body rhythm is the butt of jokes in the tavern and the subject of cautionary tales by the fire. And yet, women weren't silent victims. You catch hints of their resistance, sharp tongues lashing back with humor of their own. A wife might retort that her husband's ale turns sour because he waters it down, not because she stirred it. A daughter might laugh at her father's fears, teasing that his bread fails because he eats half the flour. These small barbs, slipped into conversation, reveal resilience. Even in the face of ridicule, women found ways to turn the joke back, to remind men that ignorance is hardly strength. Still, the jokes carried weight. Over time, they shaped how girls saw themselves. Imagine a young girl hearing her father joke at the tavern about women's curse. She blushes, knowing her own first bleeding has only just begun. She absorbs the laughter, not as amusement, but as warning. This is how her body will be talked about for the rest of her life. And so shame settles in early, reinforced by every chuckle and every crude word. The tavern fades into the night as you step outside, the stars bright above the dark thatched roofs. You realize that men's jokes and fears weren't only idle chatter. They were tools, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, that reinforced control. A world that laughed at women's cycles was a world that made women smaller, quieter, and more careful. And yet, as always, there's a stubborn note of endurance. Women endured the laughter, endured the myths, endured the fear, carrying on with the same steady rhythm. They folded cloths, stirred stews, reaped grain, and lived through the monthly tide, regardless of men's nervous jokes. And beneath the laughter, if you listen closely enough, you hear something else. The quiet strength of women refusing to let ridicule define them. You drift now into a different kind of story, not the jokes of taverns or the rules of kitchens, but the shimmering, dangerous legends of saints and holy women. In the dim light of monasteries, where candles burn low and monks' quills scratch against parchment, menstrual blood becomes something altogether stranger. Miraculous to some, monstrous to others. You pause by a carved wooden lectern where a friar reads aloud the life of a saint. The listeners nod solemnly as he describes a holy woman whose body bled not in the ordinary way, but in divine excess. Her blood was said to carry the fragrance of roses, proof of God's grace transforming even impurity into sanctity. In other tales, saints endured endless flows as a mark of suffering, like a stigmata of the womb. Their bleeding was cast as mystical, set apart from the ordinary rhythms of women's lives. One mainstream historical fact: medieval hagiographies, those biographies of saints, often depicted women's bodies as sites of miracles, their blood linked to visions, healings, or martyrdom. And while ordinary menstruation was labeled impure, the blood of a saint could be praised as holy. The contradiction is sharp. The same substance that excluded women from altars could, under divine narrative, crown them with sanctity. Quirky tidbits abound in these legends. One story tells of a nun whose menstrual blood, mixed with dust, cured the blindness of a child. Another claimed that a saintly woman bled so heavily that the earth itself absorbed her flow without trace, a sign that heaven intervened to hide her shame. You raise an eyebrow, but for medieval believers, such tales weren't absurd. They were proof that God could rewrite even the most taboo realities. Historians still argue whether these stories reflected real attempts by women to reclaim their cycles as holy, or whether male authors invented them as metaphors of suffering. Either way, they reveal a deep ambivalence. Menstrual blood could be divine miracle or dangerous poison, depending on who told the tale. Not all legends were kind. Some cast menstruating women as threats to holiness. In one cautionary tale, a nun was said to have defiled the Eucharist simply by bleeding in its presence. Another story accused a woman of using her menstrual blood to bewitch a relic, turning it powerless. These dark tales reinforce the suspicion that even holy women could carry danger within their monthly flow. You imagine the double bind for women in convents. On one hand, their cycles mark them as ordinary, fragile, unclean. On the other, those same cycles could be recast as divine suffering, proof of mystical closeness to Christ's passion. The body was never neutral. It was either condemned or exalted, never simply accepted. Picture a nun kneeling in her cell, her hands clasped, her linen shift damp with blood. She prays not only for her soul, but for her body to be understood rightly, to be seen as more than impurity. Outside, her sisters sing in the chapel, their voices rising in harmony. She rises, joins them, her secret pain hidden beneath the sound of psalms. At the same time, lay people on the outside told their own tales. Villagers whispered of women whose cycles stopped suddenly, interpreting it as a sign of divine punishment, or worse, witchcraft. Others claimed that especially pious women bled less, their bodies purified by holiness. You see how the cycle itself became a spiritual yardstick, measuring virtue or sin through something no woman could control. You can't help but notice the irony. Medieval theology often glorified blood, the blood of Christ, the blood of martyrs, the blood spilled in battle for God. Yet when it came from women's bodies each month, it was stigmatized. Only in rare, saintly exceptions did it gain value. And even then, it was reinterpreted to fit a narrative written by men. As you step away from the monastery, the chants fading behind you, you carry the strange tension of these stories. To be holy and bleeding was possible, but only if the story was spun right. To be ordinary and bleeding was dangerous. The line between miracle and stigma was drawn not by women's bodies, but by the words of those who described them. Still, within these stories, you sense a subtle power. Even if shaped by monks' quills, they preserved women's bodies at the center of spiritual imagination. And perhaps, in the silence of their cloisters, some women reinterpreted these tales for themselves, not as shame, but as a reminder that even their bleeding could not keep them from God. You step now into a dim, smoky cottage where the real experts of women's bodies sit, midwives. Their hands are worn from work, their eyes keen from years of watching, and their knowledge is stitched together from practice, not parchment. In a world where physicians argue in Latin and priests thunder about sin, it is the midwife who actually listens when a woman whispers about her bleeding. Picture her by the hearth, a bundle of dried herbs hanging overhead, a clay pot of ointment simmering beside her. A young woman, pale and anxious, confides that her monthly flow has stopped. The midwife nods, stirs the pot, and offers both reassurance and a bitter infusion of pennyroyal to bring down the courses. She does not call it disease. She calls it rhythm, knowing that bodies sometimes stumble. A mainstream historical fact: midwives in the Middle Ages often blended practical herbalism with the frameworks of humoral theory, straddling the line between folk wisdom and learned home medicine. Their role was essential, especially in communities far from towns where physicians charged fees no peasant could pay. Women trusted midwives because they shared the same experiences, because they too bled each month. Yet their knowledge was precarious. Historians still argue whether midwives were truly respected community healers or viewed with suspicion as potential witches. Both are probably true, depending on the moment. One month, she is praised for easing a difficult birth. The next, she is accused of causing illness by touching dough while unclean. Authority could turn on her as quickly as weather. Quirky tidbits sprinkle her reputation. Some midwives carried charms stitched into their aprons, tiny parchment prayers written backwards, thought to ward off bad spirits. Others whispered incantations while grinding herbs, blurring the line between medicine and magic. Villagers might trust her remedies one day, then mutter nervously the next, fearful that her power over bleeding was unnatural. Still, you see her strength in how she builds solidarity. Women gather in her kitchen, not only for medicine, but for advice, comfort, even humor. A girl with painful cramps learns to warm a flat stone by the fire and press it to her belly. Another learns how to fold linen more snugly, avoiding chafing. They swap stories of how their mothers coped, how their grandmothers managed, weaving a tapestry of continuity. In this quiet space, the shame of menstruation fades a little, replaced by the matter-of-fact tone of lived experience. The midwife herself is no stranger to these struggles. She, too, has bled while kneeling beside a birthing woman, while carrying water, while kneading bread. Her expertise doesn't erase her own pain. It sharpens her empathy. She knows what cramps feel like, what fear grips a girl at her first blood, what relief comes when the cycle returns after a long silence. And yet, the dangers remain. One angry husband, convinced his wife's heavy bleeding is a curse, could accuse the midwife of witchcraft. One priest, wary of her herbal brews, could see diabolical whispers in her remedies. Her livelihood depends on walking a narrow path, helping women, healing bodies, but never drawing too much notice. Still, her presence is indispensable. Without her, Countless women would face their cycles with only fear and silence. With her, they find a semblance of control, a reminder that they are not alone. You imagine her at night, sitting by the hearth after the last visitor has gone, grinding sage leaves into powder. She hums softly, half prayer, half lullaby, her hands moving with practiced ease. Around her, the village sleeps, unaware that the quiet strength of their women rests partly in her hands. In the flicker of her fire, you see the bridge she represents. Between folk remedies and scholarly theory, between isolation and community, between stigma and survival. She is neither saint nor scholar, yet she shapes women's lives in ways more profound than either. As you leave her cottage, the scent of herbs clings to you, mingling with the crackle of fire in your ears, and you realize the story of menstruation in the Middle Ages is not only one of shame and restriction, it is also one of hands like hers, steady and worn, passing on resilience with every cloth, every brew, every whisper. You step out of the midwife's smoky cottage and into the quieter murmur of women's voices gathered in a corner of the village square. Here, the rules of men, the priest's prohibitions, the physician's theories, the husband's jokes, fall away, replaced by something softer and more enduring. The Whisper Network. It is invisible in chronicles, ignored in manuscripts, but it is here, braided into every conversation between women when no one else is listening. Picture a circle of women shelling peas by a doorway, their hands busy, but their words careful. One girl leans closer and whispers about the ache in her belly and the shame of her first bloodstain. An older woman, lips pursed against a smile, tells her to fold the linen thicker, to keep a moss dry in a clay pot near the hearth, to rest if she can. A third woman adds, with a wink, that goose fat works wonders against chafing. And just like that, practical knowledge is passed on, not in books, not in sermons, but in hushed tones over vegetables and chores. A mainstream historical fact. Most of what we know about women's daily coping in the Middle Ages comes not from official records, but from the margins, court cases, household accounts, or rare mentions in medical texts. The real knowledge, the real strategies, lived in these invisible exchanges, spoken from woman to woman across generations. The network is not only about remedies, it is about solidarity. When one woman's linen is ruined, another quietly offers a spare cloth. When one is mocked by men for a stain, another walks beside her the next day, so she is not alone. When rumors rise, women sometimes shield one another, deflecting blame with a laugh or an excuse. Their whispers stitch a safety net in a world that offers them little protection. One quirky tidbit you stumble upon in these whispered spaces. Some women believed that if they shared their cloths, washed and passed down, it created a bond of loyalty, almost like a secret sisterhood. Whether superstition or simple practicality, the act of sharing turned necessity into connection. Imagine a girl wearing her mother's carefully folded rag, feeling not only covered, but carried by generations of resilience. Historians still argue whether this whisper network gave women genuine power or only small comforts. On one hand, it offered no public voice, no formal authority. On the other, it was the only realm where women's lived experience truly mattered. And sometimes, survival is shaped less by loud victories and more by quiet, unbroken chains of advice. You notice how these whispers cross boundaries. In the castle kitchen, noble women's maids share the same remedies as peasant wives, exchanging herbs behind tapestries. In convents, nuns trade advice during laundry duties, cloaked by the steam of hot water. Across class and rank, the blood itself creates a common language, spoken in lowered voices, but understood everywhere. Imagine the comfort this gives. A girl who once thought she carried her burden alone suddenly learns that every woman she knows has endured the same cramps, the same fear of stains, the same whispered jokes from men. She listens, learns, and laughs a little through her tears. The shame loosens its grip when she sees it shared. Of course, the whisper network has its limits. A single harsh priest can silence it, labeling women's talk as gossip or sin. A single accusation of witchcraft can turn whispered remedies into dangerous secrets. But the whispers persist anyway. They slip beneath doors, travel along streams, settle into kitchens, always finding ways to pass from one generation to the next. And so, as you lean closer to the circle of women shelling peas, you hear more than advice. You hear the rhythm of endurance, disguised as ordinary chatter. You hear women weaving a quiet counter-narrative against a world that shames them. You hear connection, solidarity, and strength humming just beneath the surface of daily life. When you leave, the whispers follow you like a gentle echo, reminding you that in every age, even when silence is enforced, women find ways to speak. You wander now into the echoing halls of a university, where scholars in long robes pace beneath vaulted ceilings, their voices solemn and sure. Here, menstruation is not whispered about in kitchens or cloisters. It is dissected, debated, and scribbled into manuscripts thick with ink and dust. To these men of learning, a woman's monthly cycle is a puzzle of humors, fertility, and purpose, and every drop of blood becomes material for grand theories. A mainstream historical fact: medieval medicine leaned heavily on Galen's teachings, where the body was thought to balance four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Menstruation was interpreted as the female body's way of purging excess blood, keeping her humors in check. But if the flow was irregular, that was evidence of imbalance, illness, or even moral failing. Women's health was reduced to theories drawn on parchment rather than lived truth. You listen as one scholar insists that menstruation is nature's way of cooling the female body, since women are colder and wetter than men. Another argues it's a form of purification, like letting a furnace vent its smoke. A third contradicts them both, claiming that blood retained in the womb could rot and breed disease. Historians still argue whether these debates were confined to academic circles or whether they trickled into villages, but their shadow stretched long, shaping attitudes for centuries. One quirky tidbit: some physicians believed that if a woman did not bleed regularly, her unused blood would rise to her brain, causing madness or visions. Others swore that menstrual blood could suffocate a fetus if it failed to escape. These theories may sound absurd now, but in their time, they were printed, taught, and passed along as scientific truth. You can almost see the student, quill poised, nodding seriously as if this nonsense were divine revelation. Of course, the debates didn't end at the body. They spilled into arguments about women's very nature. Some scholars claimed menstruation proved women were weaker, prone to irrational moods, their bodies unruly compared to men's steady systems. Others twisted it the opposite way, suggesting women were healthier because their bodies had a built-in mechanism for release. Either way, the conclusion was rarely in women's favor, because the debate itself was framed without women's voices. Picture a young woman sitting in the same city where these scholars lecture. She feels her cycle falter 1 month, then return heavily the next. She doesn't think in terms of humors or purification. She thinks in terms of pain, of embarrassment, of relief when the flow ends. But if she sought advice, a physician would talk about blocked vapors or wandering wombs, as though her body were a malfunctioning machine. Her experience becomes invisible beneath the weight of theory. At times, theories collided hilariously with reality. One physician warned that women should avoid vigorous activity during their cycles, lest they upset the balance of humors. Yet peasants in the fields had no such luxury. They bent, hauled, and harvested whether they bled or not. Another scholar swore that sexual intercourse during menstruation would produce monstrous offspring, children born with deformities or beastly tempers. You imagine the nervous silence of couples who believed this, living in fear of conceiving a child with the devil's face. And then there was fertility. To scholars, menstruation was inseparable from reproduction. A regular cycle meant a woman was marriageable, capable of bearing heirs. An irregular cycle sparked whispers of barrenness, sometimes enough to dissolve betrothals or tarnish reputations. For queens and noblewomen, this became a matter of politics. A missed period might signal hope of an heir, or suspicion of infertility that could topple dynasties. Every cramp, every silence of the womb became entangled with power. Historians still argue how much women themselves absorbed these scholarly ideas. Some may have laughed them off. Others likely believed, especially when priests echoed the same theories from pulpits. But the effect is clear. Women's monthly cycles became not only their private burden, but also public material for men to analyze, legislate, and control. You leave the university halls with the sound of quills scratching still in your ears. What you carry with you is the sense of debate without empathy, grand words that ignored the lived reality. And yet, woven into the arguments are glimpses of truth. That menstruation mattered, that it shaped life profoundly, even if the scholars misunderstood it. And so, you step back into the wider world, where women's endurance continues, quietly resisting the weight of debates that never asked for their voices. You walk now into the twilight of this medieval journey, the air heavy with centuries of silence and whispers. The streets you've wandered, the kitchens, cloisters, taverns, and castles blur into one tapestry, each thread soaked with the same steady rhythm of blood and secrecy. And as you look closer, you begin to see how these echoes stretch beyond the Middle Ages into corners of our own world that still carry the faint stain of shame. Think of the gossip that followed women in villages when a loaf failed, or when milk soured in a churn. Now picture the modern version. Jokes at school about that time of the month, hushed conversations in workplaces, advertising that hides pads in sleek blue liquid instead of honest red. The words have changed, but the undertone remains. Menstruation is something to be disguised, to be tucked away. A mainstream historical fact is that taboos surrounding periods never vanished entirely. They adapted, reshaped by culture, but still recognizable. Quirky tidbits crop up even today. Some countries still impose restrictions that echo medieval bans. Women told not to enter temples, or myths that their touch can spoil food. You can almost hear the medieval farmer laughing in recognition. And yet, despite the centuries between, the shared thread is discomfort, not in the bleeding itself, but in the way society insists on treating it as other, dangerous, laughable. Historians still argue how directly medieval beliefs shaped modern stigma, or whether shame grows fresh in every age. Was it the church's voice, or physicians' quills, or simply human unease with bodies that carried the taboo forward? Perhaps all of them together. What's clear is that echoes remain. Women today may have pads, tampons, apps, and painkillers, but the same silence still lingers in corners of conversation. And yet, just as in the Middle Ages, women carry on. They share advice in whispers and in group chats. They build networks of solidarity, sometimes digital, sometimes face-to-face. They laugh at the same nervous jokes men still make, but they also answer back louder now. They create art, activism, and education to reclaim what was once hidden. In a way, they continue the legacy of medieval women, the endurance, the quiet resistance, the insistence that life goes on no matter what. You imagine the long chain of connection, a peasant rinsing linen at dawn by a stream, a noblewoman adjusting her gown in a candlelit hall, a nun kneeling in her cell, blood hidden beneath her habit, a student today slipping a pad into her pocket between classes. Different worlds, same rhythm. The echoes remind you that stigma is not inevitable. If shame can be created by stories, it can be undone by stories too. Perhaps the medieval whisper networks, fragile though they were the first small acts of resistance, the seeds of conversations still growing today. And as your journey winds to its close, you let the images soften. Women at hearths, at altars, at fields and courts, carrying both the burden and the strength of their cycles. The story is not only about restriction and ridicule, it is also about resilience, ingenuity, and solidarity. You slow your steps now, the village fading into mist, the castle walls dissolving into dusk. Your breath grows steady, your thoughts calmer, as the rhythm of history blends with the rhythm of rest. So here you are, at the edge of the tale, where the clamor of the Middle Ages has softened into quiet. Let your body sink into the chair or bed beneath you, feeling its weight supported fully. The cobblestones, the smoky kitchens, the candlelit chapels, they drift away now, like scenes behind a closing curtain. You breathe slower, deeper, as though centuries themselves are exhaling with you. The voices of priests, physicians, and peasants fade, replaced by the steadier sound of your own heartbeat. Each beat carries the reminder that bodies, in all their quirks and rhythms, are simply human. No shame, no stain, just life continuing forward. Imagine the women you met on this journey, their hands steady at work, their faces calm, even in pain. They, too, slowed at night, closing their eyes against flickering firelight, letting the world's judgment wait until morning. Let yourself follow them now. Picture the soft rustle of linen, the warmth of a hearth, the hush of whispers that no one else can hear. These images cradle you, like a quilt stitched from centuries of survival and care. You are not in a noisy tavern anymore, nor a cold stone church, nor a muddy field. You are here, in this moment of stillness, carrying only the quiet strength of all those lives. As your breath slows even further, feel the weight in your limbs melt away, the thoughts in your mind dissolving like mist on a river. The story ends not in shame, but in calm resilience. You can rest knowing the world has always carried both burdens and strength, and tonight it carries you gently toward sleep.